In a quiet corner of the small town of Crestwood, Texas, lived a woman who was as much a part of the landscape as the old oak trees lining the streets. Mrs. Evelyn Williams, at 75, had witnessed the changing tides of her neighborhood for decades. The streets, once bustling with families who had known each other for generations, were now dominated by new faces. Young professionals with their shiny cars and pristine lawns. The homes were being renovated, gentrified, and with each coat of fresh paint, the soul of the neighborhood seemed to slip further away. But to Mrs. Williams, her house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was a legacy, a place where she had raised 3 children, buried her husband, and weathered life's storms. It was a sanctuary where she sat every evening on the front porch, sipping her tea and watching the world pass by, a silent witness to the life that unfolded before her. The house, with its peeling shutters and faded brick, was a testament to the life she had built here, and it held the memories of decades of laughter, sorrow, and triumph. On that warm summer evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the street, Mrs. Williams sat in her familiar rocking chair. The creak of the wood was the only sound breaking the silence, a soft contrast to the distant hum of the city. Her tea sat beside her, steam rising gently from the chipped mug she'd used for years. She wasn't thinking about much, just enjoying the quiet, the stillness. The world felt like it was slowing down, a moment of peace in a life that had been anything but still. But that evening, everything was about to change. Across the street, a new neighbor, a woman named Carol who had moved into the freshly renovated house just 2 doors down, was walking her dog. Mrs. Williams had noticed Carol before. Always a little too brisk, a little too hurried, never looking her in the eye. Tonight, Carol walked a little faster than usual, glancing over at Mrs. Williams' porch with the kind of look that suggested she was uncomfortable, maybe even afraid. She clutched her phone a little tighter, her steps quickening as she passed by the house. Mrs. Williams, with her seasoned calm, let out a slow breath, watching as the young woman hurried on. It was the same reaction she had seen from others in the neighborhood, looks of curiosity, suspicion, or even fear. She was used to it by now, the way people looked past her or crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her sitting there. It didn't bother her as much anymore, but it still hurt. It always hurt. To some, she was just an old woman sitting on her porch, out of place in a neighborhood that had forgotten its roots. To them, she wasn't a mother, a grandmother, a witness to history. She was an inconvenience, something that didn't belong. As the evening stretched on, Mrs. Williams continued to rock, her eyes following the silhouette of Carol disappearing down the block. She had seen it all before. The silent judgments, the whispers behind closed doors. She had spent her life pushing through those moments, not letting them define her. She was here, and that was enough. But tonight something was different. She could feel it in the air, a change, a shift, as if the world itself was holding its breath. It didn't take long for her to hear the sound of sirens approaching. A police car, its lights flashing in the distance, rumbled down the street, breaking the stillness of the evening. Mrs. Williams had seen the cruiser before, but never like this. The car stopped right in front of her house and 2 officers got out, their movements deliberate as if they were on a mission. The first officer, Officer John Harris, a tall man with a no-nonsense attitude, stepped forward. His partner, Officer Derek Martin, followed close behind. Both were young, just starting their careers in law enforcement, and both had that air of authority that was often mistaken for respect. As they walked toward the porch, Mrs. Williams didn't move. She didn't need to. She had spent years perfecting the art of stillness. "Ma'am," Officer Harris called out, his voice sharp, "can we ask you what you're doing out here?" Mrs. Williams looked up slowly, her eyes meeting his with a calm that seemed to catch him off guard. "I'm sitting on my porch," she said, her voice steady, unaffected by his presence, "just enjoying the evening." The officers exchanged a look, the kind that said they were not satisfied with her answer. Officer Martin stepped forward, his tone more demanding. "You've been sitting here for a while, haven't you? We've received a complaint about a suspicious person in the area, and you match the description." Mrs. Williams raised an eyebrow but did not stand up. "Suspicious?" she asked, her voice still calm. "What exactly am I being accused of?" "We need to ask a few questions," Officer Harris said, his tone growing sharper. "Why are you here at this time of day, and why are you sitting alone?" Mrs. Williams remained unmoved, her hand gently resting on the armrest of her chair. She had heard questions like these before. She had lived through moments like this, moments when her very existence was called into question because of the color of her skin, because of the space she occupied in a world that didn't want to make room for her. But she had learned to survive those moments, to keep her dignity intact. "I've been sitting here since early afternoon," she said slowly, her voice laced with the wisdom of years lived. "I'm not hurting anyone. I'm not doing anything wrong." The officers didn't back down. They pressed her further, their questions more intrusive now, their accusations more pointed. Mrs. Williams felt the weight of their judgment bearing down on her, but she didn't flinch. She had faced worse, and she had survived it. She would survive this, too. And then, just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, the sound of a car pulling up broke the standoff. Mrs. Williams didn't need to look. She knew who it was. She could hear the engine, the rhythm of the tires on the pavement. It was her son, Marcus Jefferson. He had arrived just in time. As the car stopped and Marcus stepped out, the officer's demeanor shifted. They had no idea who they were dealing with now. The woman they had thought they could push around was not just anyone. She was Marcus' mother, and Marcus was someone who commanded respect in his own right. He wasn't just her son. He was a man with power, with authority, and with a deep, unshakable sense of justice. "Is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but firm. He didn't raise it, but it carried weight. In that moment, everything changed. The officers realized they had misjudged the situation completely. Mrs. Williams wasn't just an elderly woman sitting on her porch. She was a force to be reckoned with, and her son wasn't just any man. He was a protector, a leader, and someone who had made it his mission to right the wrongs of a world that so often turned a blind eye to the struggles of people like his mother. The confrontation on that porch wasn't just about one elderly woman and a couple of officers. It was a battle of dignity versus ignorance, of grace versus aggression, and in that moment, dignity and grace won. As the evening wore on in Crestwood, Texas, the air seemed to hang heavy with anticipation. The sun dipped lower, casting an amber glow across the neat rows of houses on Maple Street. The sounds of crickets filled the air, their rhythmic hum adding to the stillness of the night. The world outside was slowing down, but inside, an energy was building, one that would soon break the quiet of the evening like a storm. On the porch of the modest two-story house sat Mrs. Evelyn Williams, rocking gently in her chair. Her silver hair, neatly pinned, shimmered in the fading light, and her deep brown eyes, full of wisdom and history, looked out across the neighborhood she had called home for over 50 years. The houses around her had been transformed, renovated, and gentrified beyond recognition. New families had moved in, and many of her old neighbors had been priced out. The neighborhood, once filled with familiar faces and shared stories, now seemed like a foreign place. But Evelyn, a woman of strength and resilience, wasn't bothered by the changes. She had weathered storms far worse than this, both literal and figurative, and had learned how to find peace in the midst of it all. Sipping her chamomile tea from her favorite chipped mug, Evelyn allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The porch was hers, a space she had reclaimed each day for decades. She had raised her children here, buried her husband here, and survived cancer here. It was a sanctuary, a place of solace where she could simply exist, untouched by the world's judgment. The rocking chair creaked softly beneath her, its rhythm a comforting reminder of the passage of time. But time, as it often does, was about to catch up with her. Across the street, a woman named Carol, a new neighbor who had moved into one of the freshly renovated homes, was walking her dog. Carol had always been a little aloof, never quite comfortable with the presence of someone like Evelyn in the neighborhood. The unspoken divide between them was palpable, and tonight that divide would become the spark that set off a chain of events neither of them could have predicted. As Carol walked her dog past Evelyn's house, her eyes flicked over to the porch, her gaze lingering a little longer than usual. Evelyn noticed the shift in Carol's pace, how she stiffened, quickened her steps, and gripped her phone a little tighter. Carol's eyes avoided Evelyn's, as though she was afraid of making eye contact, afraid of acknowledging the history and presence that Evelyn embodied. It wasn't the first time Evelyn had felt this type of unease from the newcomers in the neighborhood, but tonight it felt sharper, more intentional. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her breath steady and measured. She had seen it all before. The glances, the side eyes, the unspoken assumption that she didn't belong in this newly remodeled neighborhood. She had become in many ways invisible, a relic of a past that was no longer welcome in the shiny new Crestwood that had emerged in recent years. But she didn't let it bother her. Not anymore. She had learned to live with it, to find strength in the very things that made her an outsider. But that night, something about Carol's hurried steps and the way she gripped her phone sent a chill through the air, a feeling of unease that Evelyn couldn't shake. Something was coming. She didn't know what, but she could feel it, deep in her bones. The tension that had always lingered beneath the surface of her quiet existence was starting to boil over. Minutes later, Evelyn heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Her eyes narrowed as she saw the flashing lights of a police car rounding the corner of her street. 2 officers, their faces set with purpose, pulled up in front of her house. The cruiser's engine rumbled to a stop, its presence a stark contrast to the peaceful quiet that had once defined this neighborhood. The officers were young, fresh out of the academy, eager to prove themselves in the field. Officer James Harris, a tall man with a commanding posture, stepped out first. He looked at Evelyn with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, as if her very presence on the porch was an anomaly that needed to be explained. His partner, Officer Daniel Miller, a younger man with less certainty in his eyes, followed close behind. Both officers were ready for action, but neither could have anticipated the confrontation that was about to unfold. Evelyn didn't move as they approached. She didn't need to. She had seen this before. She had dealt with the police in her community for years, each encounter an unwelcome reminder of the assumptions people had about her, simply because of her age and skin color. But tonight, Evelyn was different. She wasn't going to allow this moment to be another example of the system treating her like an outsider. She was going to stand her ground. "Ma'am," Officer Harris called out, his voice polite but firm, "can we ask what you're doing out here?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She looked up slowly, meeting his gaze with a quiet strength that only decades of life had provided. "I'm sitting on my porch," she replied, her voice steady, unwavering. "Just enjoying the evening." Harris took a step closer, his eyes scanning her face for any hint of resistance, any sign that she might be hiding something. "We've had reports of someone suspicious in the neighborhood," he said, his tone now tinged with an underlying judgment. "Can you explain why you're here?" Evelyn's gaze didn't falter. "I'm sitting here because it's my home," she said, her words calm but sharp. "I've lived here longer than either of you have worn a badge, and I don't need to explain myself to anyone." The officers exchanged a glance, but Evelyn didn't wait for them to speak. She knew where this conversation was headed. It had been the same every time. A woman of her age, in this neighborhood, simply existing became a cause for suspicion. They wanted to make her a suspect in her own life. But she wouldn't let that happen. The tension between them thickened as Officer Harris took another step forward. His hand hovered near his holster, a subtle gesture that spoke volumes. Evelyn noticed it immediately. She had seen that move before, had felt the weight of it in countless interactions with authority figures who had been trained to see her as a threat simply because of who she was. But she wasn't afraid. She had survived worse. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low but firm. "We have a job to do, and you're making this difficult." Evelyn didn't rise from her chair. She didn't need to. She had learned long ago that sometimes the greatest form of resistance was simply refusing to move. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice unwavering. "You can ask your questions, but I will not be intimidated." In that moment, Evelyn understood something that the officers didn't. Her presence wasn't a threat. Her silence wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of power, of dignity, of survival. It was the quiet strength that had carried her through years of hardship, through a lifetime of being overlooked and underestimated, and tonight it was going to carry her through this moment too. As Officer Harris took another step closer, the world seemed to slow down. Evelyn was ready, not for a confrontation, but for the recognition that would follow. She wasn't going to be pushed off her porch tonight, and when her son Marcus arrived, everything was about to change. The tension on the porch was thick, almost suffocating. Evelyn didn't blink, not once. She had seen so many of these moments before, moments where her existence felt like an accusation in the eyes of the world around her. But tonight, this quiet storm would not be moved by simple assumptions or threats. As the officers grew more agitated, Evelyn remained still, like a rock in a storm. Officer Harris, visibly frustrated, stepped closer, trying to tower over her. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, but the aggression in his demeanor was clear now, undeniable. It wasn't about the alleged suspicious activity. It was about power, control, and assumptions. As always. "Ma'am, we're asking you to step off the porch," Harris said, his voice clipped, his hand still lingering too close to his holster, a silent threat hanging in the air. "We've had a report of suspicious activity in this area and you match the description." His words carried an edge, the kind of tone that carried more weight than the accusation itself. Evelyn met his gaze with the calmness that only years of experience could provide. She had lived through the civil rights movement, seen the world change around her, and yet here she was, in the same position again, questioning the authority of those who came with pre-made judgments. She knew her place, not just in her own home, but in the bigger picture. Her silence wasn't just silence, it was resistance, a quiet stand against the injustice that had been embedded into this country for centuries. "I'm not going anywhere," Evelyn said, her voice clear, even, and unwavering. "I've done nothing wrong. You can ask your questions, but I will not leave my own porch. You'll have to take me if you want to arrest me." There was a pause, a charged silence that hung between them like a looming storm cloud. Harris's hand tightened around his holster, but even in that moment, Evelyn remained unfazed. She had survived far worse than this, far more dangerous moments in her life, moments when her very existence had been questioned and threatened. Miller, the younger officer, shifted uncomfortably. His hand hovered near his own holster, but there was a noticeable hesitation in his movements. He had seen the same thing Evelyn had, his partner pushing forward with aggression while his own instincts told him something was off, something wasn't right. This wasn't the confrontation they had been sent here for. Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she sat still, watching the two officers with the kind of quiet defiance that only years of experience could give. She had seen too many of her neighbors, too many of her friends, fall into the trap of fear and submission when faced with authority. Not her, though. Not tonight. But then, as the standoff grew more intense, the sound of a car engine approached, and Evelyn didn't have to look up to know who it was. That familiar hum, the rhythm of the engine, the precise way the tires hit the pavement. She knew it all. This was the sound she had been waiting for. A sleek black SUV pulled up in front of her house, its tinted windows reflecting the fading light of the day. The engine shut off with a soft hum and the door opened. A tall figure stepped out, exuding an authority that matched the quiet confidence Evelyn had always known. Elijah. Her son, her protector, had arrived. It was like the air shifted in an instant. The oppressive weight of the situation lifted just a little, the tension breaking like a thunderstorm passing by. Evelyn didn't need to rise from her chair. She didn't have to say a word. She had raised her son to be a man of integrity, a man who knew when to fight and when to speak, and tonight he was the one stepping forward. And Elijah was no stranger to this kind of thing. He had lived through the same struggles, the same battles. But now, as a grown man, a commander in the State Bureau of Homeland Security, he was no longer just the child Evelyn had raised. He was a force to be reckoned with. And when he approached the officers, his calm demeanor carried more authority than they could have ever anticipated. "What's going on here?" Elijah's voice was steady, calm, but there was an undeniable power behind his words. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded respect. Harris and Miller both froze, the shift in the atmosphere palpable. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected to face someone who wasn't just a bystander, but someone with real authority, someone who could expose them for the very assumptions they had made about his mother. "This is a police matter," Harris said, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "I'm going to have to ask you to step back, sir." But Elijah wasn't fazed. He didn't step back. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his badge, flashing it in front of the officers. It gleamed in the dimming light, and the words on it said more than anything Elijah could have said aloud. "Commander Elijah Jefferson, State Bureau of Homeland Security." The words hit like a freight train, and suddenly the two deputies were facing something far bigger than they had anticipated. They weren't dealing with an elderly woman on a porch anymore. They were standing in front of someone who held power, influence, and, most importantly, something they had never considered: personal stakes. This wasn't just a call to the police. This was his mother they had confronted, and he wasn't going to let that go unchallenged. "This woman," Elijah said, his voice firm and unwavering, "is Clara Jefferson. She's 76 years old. She's lived in this house for over 50 years. She's raised 3 children here, and she's been part of this community long before any of us were. And now, you're here harassing her. For what? Sitting on her porch?" Harris's jaw tightened, and Miller stood silently, his eyes flicking between Elijah and Clara. The arrogance they had walked in with now seemed to fade into nothingness. They were no longer the ones in control of the situation. "What exactly are you accusing my mother of?" Elijah's question was simple, but it carried a weight that neither officer could ignore. They were no longer talking to a woman they thought they could intimidate. They were facing a man who was ready to hold them accountable for their actions. "I didn't know," Harris stammered. "We had a report, a call about suspicious activity. And you thought an elderly woman sitting on her porch was suspicious?" Elijah cut him off, his voice sharp and to the point. The realization was dawning on the officers now. They had misjudged the situation, and more than that, they had misjudged Clara Jefferson. They had assumed that a woman of her age, of her background, didn't belong in a neighborhood like this, that her presence was something to be feared. But now, in the face of her son, a high-ranking officer, that assumption was crumbling. Elijah didn't let up, so you escalated the situation for a woman with no weapon, no threat, and no evidence of any wrongdoing? There was no answer from Harris, no defense. Only the sound of his breath, heavy with the weight of his actions. "We're leaving," Elijah said, his voice steady but commanding. "You'll both be reporting this incident. You'll file your reports, and if I hear that you've handled it any other way, I will make sure you're held accountable for your actions." The officers didn't argue. Slowly, they turned and walked back to their cruiser, the silence between them now heavy with the weight of what they had just experienced. They had lost, and Clara knew it. As the officers pulled away, Evelyn remained on her porch, her pride swelling as she watched her son, a man of power and integrity, stand up for her. She had never asked for this moment, never wanted it, but tonight, her son had given her something she hadn't had in years, the strength to stand firm. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt the weight of her years and the history she carried with her all come to rest in the stillness of the evening air. When Marcus Jefferson stepped off his SUV in the driveway, the tension that had crackled on Evelyn Williams's porch finally began to dissipate. The two officers, Harris and Miller, stood at the edge of the yard, their faces a shade paler than before. They knew they'd crossed a line, and the arrival of a Homeland Security commander in their own town had shifted the balance of power in an instant. Without a word, Marcus took out his phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Evelyn watched him, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and pride. She knew exactly what her son was about to do: call in the very chains of accountability Harris and Miller thought they could sidestep. "Sheriff Daniels?" Marcus's voice was calm, measured, but charged with authority. "This is Commander Jefferson. You need to suspend Officers Harris and Miller pending a full investigation into their conduct tonight on Evelyn Williams's property." He paused, listening to the reply, then added, "I want body cam footage pulled, witness statements taken, and oversight from the county's Civil Rights Division." Evelyn felt the breeze stir the rose bushes along the walk. It was as though even nature was cheering. When he hung up, Marcus turned to her. "They'll be relieved of duty by morning. No pay, no special treatment," he said softly. Evelyn nodded, her voice catching with emotion. "You did it, son." He dropped his voice. "You didn't ask for this, Mom. But I won't let them intimidate you anymore." Over the next 24 hours, word spread through Crestwood like wildfire. By breakfast, local news vans had staked out the street. Reporters pounded on the front door looking for interviews. Neighbors peered through curtains, their curiosity tinged with guilt or shame. Marcus spent the morning on calls with internal affairs, civil rights investigators, and his own superiors, ensuring every piece of evidence, from the 911 call audio to the officers' patrol logs, was secured. That afternoon, the sheriff held a hastily called press conference on the courthouse steps. Sheriff Daniels, flanked by a Civil Rights Division representative and the town's mayor, stepped to the podium. "Good afternoon," he began, clearing his throat. Yesterday evening, Officers John Harris and Daniel Miller responded to a 911 report of suspicious activity. Their conduct during that response fell far short of the standards we uphold. Effective immediately, both officers are suspended pending investigation, and we're instituting mandatory bias and de-escalation training department-wide. He paused, glancing toward Marcus, who stood at the back with colleagues from Homeland Security. The reporters erupted into questions, but the sheriff held up a hand. "One moment," he said. "We will not excuse poor judgment or prejudice, and we will continue to partner with community leaders to rebuild trust." In the seats before him, community activists, longtime residents, and newcomers listened intently. Among them sat Mrs. Angela Ramirez, a local church leader, and Mr. Kenneth White, an elderly retiree whose own granddaughter had once felt threatened by overzealous patrols. Their presence underscored a turning point. This wasn't just about Evelyn Williams anymore. It was about every person in Crestwood who'd ever felt unsafe under the guise of public safety. As the press conference ended, Evelyn and Marcus slipped away to the shade of a nearby oak. "They're listening," Evelyn remarked, nodding toward the courthouse. "I can feel it." Marcus squeezed her hand. "This is just the start, Mom. We'll push for a civilian oversight board, more youth outreach, something that makes sure no one else on this street is treated like a criminal for simply existing." That evening, Crestwood's community center hosted an open forum. Dozens packed the folding chairs. Teachers, business owners, retirees, parents, teens. At the front, a banner proclaimed, "Crestwood United, building trust in law enforcement." The mayor, Sheriff Daniels, and a Civil Rights Division rep each spoke briefly, pledging new initiatives. Then, Evelyn was invited to share her experience. She rose slowly, leaning on her cane. The room hushed. "I'm not here because I want to be a symbol," she began, her voice strong despite her years. "I'm here because for too long people who look like me have been expected to stay small, to make ourselves invisible so we don't scare anyone. I sat on my porch that night because it's my home, my sanctuary. That should never have been a crime." Her words landed like stones dropped in still water. Heads nodded, tears glistened. Among the crowd, young women scribbled notes, teens exchanged looks of determination, and a few officers in uniform stood quietly at the back, absorbing the truth of her testimony. Afterward, as people lingered to shake her hand, Evelyn caught sight of Carol, her neighbor who'd first called 911, waiting in line, a mixture of shame and resolve on her face. Evelyn didn't step away. She held out her hand. "You're welcome here," Evelyn told her softly. "Crestwood belongs to all of us." Carol grasped her hand, eyes reddened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I see now how I was wrong." Evelyn squeezed her fingers. "We all have work to do. Let's do it together." Later that night, Marcus and Evelyn sat on the porch once more. The streetlights cast long shadows and the hum of cicadas filled the air. It was quieter than it had been in days, but this time the silence felt different. Hopeful, even. Evelyn rocked gently while Marcus sat beside her, hand on her shoulder. "You were amazing tonight," Marcus said. Evelyn smiled, her gaze drifting down the street. "I just stayed still and spoke the truth. Sometimes that's enough to start a change." He nodded. Sometimes staying still is the most powerful action you can take. For a moment they sat in companionable silence, mother and son, united by love and a shared purpose. And on that porch in Crestwood, Texas, they knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they also knew they weren't standing alone. Together, they had shown their town what true resilience looked like, and that, perhaps, was the beginning of a new chapter for everyone who called Crestwood home. When Marcus Jefferson stepped off his SUV in the driveway, the tension that had crackled on Evelyn Williams's porch finally began to dissipate. The two officers, Harris and Miller, stood at the edge of the yard, their faces a shade paler than before. They knew they'd crossed a line, and the arrival of a Homeland Security commander in their own town had shifted the balance of power in an instant. Without a word, Marcus took out his phone and dialed the sheriff's office. Evelyn watched him, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and pride. She knew exactly what her son was about to do, call in the very chains of accountability Harris and Miller thought they could sidestep. "Sheriff Daniels?" Marcus's voice was calm, measured, but charged with authority. "This is Commander Jefferson. You need to suspend Officers Harris and Miller pending a full investigation into their conduct tonight on Evelyn Williams's property." He paused, listening to the reply, then added, "I want body cam footage pulled, witness statements taken, and oversight from the county's Civil Rights Division." Evelyn felt the breeze stir the rose bushes along the walk. It was as though even nature was cheering. When he hung up, Marcus turned to her. "They'll be relieved of duty by morning. No pay, no special treatment," he said softly. Evelyn nodded, her voice catching with emotion. "You did it, son." He dropped his voice. "You didn't ask for this, Mom, but I won't let them intimidate you anymore." Over the next 24 hours, word spread through Crestwood like wildfire. By breakfast, local news vans had staked out the street. Reporters pounded on the front door looking for interviews. Neighbors peered through curtains, their curiosity tinged with guilt or shame. Marcus spent the morning on calls with internal affairs, civil rights investigators, and his own superiors, ensuring every piece of evidence from the 911 call audio to the officers' patrol logs was secured. That afternoon, the sheriff held a hastily called press conference on the courthouse steps. Sheriff Daniels, flanked by a Civil Rights Division representative and the town's mayor, stepped to the podium. "Good afternoon," he began, clearing his throat. "Yesterday evening, Officers John Harris and Daniel Miller responded to a 911 report of suspicious activity. Their conduct during that response fell far short of the standards we uphold. Effective immediately, both officers are suspended pending investigation, and we're instituting mandatory bias and de-escalation training department-wide." He paused, glancing toward Marcus, who stood at the back with colleagues from Homeland Security. The reporters erupted into questions, but the sheriff held up a hand. "One moment," he said. "We will not excuse poor judgment or prejudice, and we will continue to partner with community leaders to rebuild trust." In the seats before him, community activists, longtime residents, and newcomers listened intently. Among them sat Mrs. Angela Ramirez, a local church leader, and Mr. Kenneth White, an elderly retiree whose own granddaughter had once felt threatened by overzealous patrols. Their presence underscored a turning point. This wasn't just about Evelyn Williams anymore. It was about every person in Crestwood who'd ever felt unsafe under the guise of public safety. As the press conference ended, Evelyn and Marcus slipped away to the shade of a nearby oak. "They're listening," Evelyn remarked, nodding toward the courthouse. "I can feel it." Marcus squeezed her hand. "This is just the start, Mom. We'll push for a civilian oversight board, more youth outreach, something that makes sure no one else on this street is treated like a criminal for simply existing." That evening, Crestwood's community center hosted an open forum. Dozens packed the folding chairs. Teachers, business owners, retirees, parents, teens. At the front, a banner proclaimed Crestwood United, building trust in law enforcement. The mayor, Sheriff Daniels, and a civil rights division rep each spoke briefly, pledging new initiatives. Then, Evelyn was invited to share her experience. She rose slowly, leaning on her cane. The room hushed. "I'm not here because I want to be a symbol," she began, her voice strong despite her years. "I'm here because for too long, people who look like me have been expected to stay small, to make ourselves invisible so we don't scare anyone. I sat on my porch that night because it's my home, my sanctuary. That should never have been a crime." Her words landed like stones dropped in still water. Heads nodded, tears glistened. Among the crowd, young women scribbled notes, teens exchanged looks of determination, and a few officers in uniform stood quietly at the back, absorbing the truth of her testimony. Afterward, as people lingered to shake her hand, Evelyn caught sight of Carol, her neighbor, who'd first called 911, waiting in line, a mixture of shame and resolve on her face. Evelyn didn't step away. She held out her hand. "You're welcome here," Evelyn told her softly. "Crestwood belongs to all of us." Carol grasped her hand, eyes reddened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I see now how I was wrong." Evelyn squeezed her fingers. "We all have work to do. Let's do it together." Later that night, Marcus and Evelyn sat on the porch once more. The streetlights cast long shadows and the hum of cicadas filled the air. It was quieter than it had been in days, but this time the silence felt different, hopeful even. Evelyn rocked gently, while Marcus sat beside her, hand on her shoulder. "You were amazing tonight," Marcus said. Evelyn smiled, her gaze drifting down the street. "I just stayed still and spoke the truth. Sometimes that's enough to start a change." He nodded. "Sometimes staying still is the most powerful action you can take." For a moment they sat in companionable silence, mother and son, united by love and a shared purpose. And on that porch in Crestwood, Texas, they knew the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But they also knew they weren't standing alone. Together, they had shown their town what true resilience looked like. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of a new chapter for everyone who called Crestwood home. In the weeks that followed Crestwood's community forum, the winds of change began to sweep gently through the town's streets. The sheriff's department formally announced the suspension of Officers Harris and Miller, pending a full internal and civil rights division investigation. Meanwhile, the town council approved the creation of a civilian oversight board, 10 residents, appointed to review complaints, recommend training improvements, and ensure transparency in law enforcement actions going forward. Evelyn Williams sat on her porch each evening, watching these developments from her rocking chair. She noticed more friendly waves from neighbors, fewer side eyes. Children played on the sidewalks with newfound confidence. Parents called out greetings when passing by. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, nor was it complete, but it was real. And for Evelyn, that progress, born from a single refusal to be pushed off her own front steps, felt deeply satisfying. Marcus Jefferson threw himself into the work of oversight, bringing his Homeland Security expertise to the civilian board's first meetings. He pushed for clear protocols, timely release of body cam footage in contentious calls, mandatory de-escalation and bias awareness training, quarterly public reports on all use-of-force incidents. His ideas were ambitious, and not everyone in the sheriff's department was thrilled. He found himself fielding pointed questions from fellow officers at the state level, some suggesting he'd overstepped his bounds, but Marcus was undeterred. He reminded them, "This isn't about politics, it's about people's lives and trust." Evelyn watched her son navigate these pressures with the same grace she had shown decades ago. In the evenings they sat side by side, sharing tea and reflections. "You know," Evelyn said one night, "I never imagined my small stand would spark all this." Her voice was quiet but firm. Marcus smiled, leaning back in his chair. "You taught me that speaking truth, even quietly, can ignite big change. I'm just following your lead." Over the next few months, the Civilian Oversight Board held public hearings in the community center. Local residents came forward to share their experiences, both positive and negative, with law enforcement. Retiree Mr. Kenneth White recounted the time he'd been stopped at dusk and forced to lie on the ground. A young mother, Mrs. Lopez, described how her teenage son had been frisked while walking home from basketball practice. Their testimonies, collected alongside data from the sheriff's office, painted a stark picture of uneven policing patterns. At each hearing Evelyn attended in the front row, her presence a reminder of why the board existed. She no longer worried about being the center of attention. Instead, she felt proud to support her neighbors' voices. And as the board adopted policy changes, like requiring clear written reasons for every pedestrian stop, she knew that Crestwood was, in small but meaningful ways, reclaiming its own sense of safety and community. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after that fateful confrontation, the town came together to dedicate a small bronze plaque at the base of Evelyn's oak tree. Carved into it were the words, "In honor of Evelyn Williams, for sitting still and speaking truth." The plaque wasn't placed on her house. It was positioned beneath the tree that shaded her porch, symbolizing the deep roots she'd laid in this community. At the ceremony, Mayor Thompson spoke softly but earnestly. "Evelyn Williams reminded all of us what dignity looks like. She showed us that every person, regardless of age, race, or background, deserves respect in their own home. Let this plaque stand as a reminder that change begins with courage in the quietest moments." Evelyn, flanked by Marcus and several board members, accepted the applause with a shy nod. She felt the warmth of the community's gratitude, but more than that, she felt a profound sense of relief and hope. Relief that the neighborhood she loved was opening itself up again, making space for every voice. Hope that the next generation of children growing up here would see their town as a place where they truly belong. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across Crestwood streets, Evelyn and Marcus sat on the porch one last time before the plaque unveiling crowd dispersed. The oak tree's branches rustled in the breeze, as if in applause. Evelyn took a slow sip of her tea and sighed contentedly. "You did good," she said. Marcus reached over, squeezing her hand. "We did good." Behind them, the porch lights glowed softly, illuminating the plaque and the rocking chair where Evelyn had taken her stand. And though the neighborhood would continue to change, as all places do, one thing was certain: the spirit of that confrontation, the power of quiet resistance, and the importance of speaking out would live on in Crestwood's story, inspiring others to find their own courage whenever they needed it. If Evelyn's journey moved you, if it reminded you that no matter how small your voice may feel, it can still spark real change, please hit like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs that reminder, and let me know in the comments. Press 1 if you believe in standing your ground, or 0 if you have ideas on how we can keep making these stories even more impactful. Your voice matters, just like Evelyn's did. And so, from a quiet evening on her front porch, Evelyn Williams' simple act of sitting still and speaking her truth became a beacon for an entire community. She didn't march in protest or file high-profile lawsuits. Instead, she held her ground and let her dignity shine a light on the assumptions that had long gone unchallenged. When her son Marcus Jefferson, a Homeland Security commander, arrived and demanded accountability, it showed that courage paired with compassion can move even the most entrenched systems to change. What this story teaches us is that resilience isn't always loud. Sometimes the greatest power lies in the calm refusal to be pushed aside. Your voice matters, including the quiet ones, and sharing your experience can spark real transformation. Community oversight and open dialogue remind us that justice isn't handed down, it's built together. And those in positions of authority must remember they serve the people, not the other way around. If Evelyn's journey inspired you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories that challenge and uplift. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that standing your ground, even in silence, can change everything. Let us know in the comments how you've found strength in stillness or spoken out for what's right. Your story could be the next spark.